ache and this and that and everything else, and he'd write you a prescription. You go to the drugstore and you present it to the druggist. So my dad, being very up to date, he had a doctor friend, and you get these prescription pads. There'd be 50 on a pad. So he'd go to this doctor and he'd give him 2 pads and he'd sign 100 of them. But Dad had to give him $1 for every one. So Dad would go back to the drugstore, and somebody would come in and say, "Oh, Mr. Hinkebein, I just feel so bad. I think my heart's kind of beating." He says, "I guess you need a little alcohol." He says, "Yes, could you arrange that?" He says, "Yes." He says, "The prescription itself, I had to give a dollar to the doctor." He says that, and he said, "I'll give you a pint of whiskey, but it's going to cost you $2. So this is the kind of stuff that went on. And my mother and dad, they were quite social people in their day and time. And I guess you might say am I doing this thing right? Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, bridge seems to be the game that my mother and dad played. The bridge. This is what I guess the ladies and the gentlemen, they played bridge. So every I don't know, whatever time it came, when Mom and Dad would have a bridge party, and of course us kids were supposed to get out of the way. Don't bother the bridge. So they would have bridge parties, and they'd have a couple of 2 or 3 tables set up in the living room, dining room, and they would serve a meal. Dad would always serve cocktails. Dad, being a frugal man as he was, being in the drug business, Dad had access to this 110% alcohol. So Dad would take this 110% alcohol and he'd pour it in a big bucket and put a couple of regular bottles of whiskey on top of it, shake it all up and put it back in the bottle. And I tell you, when those guys had a couple of those drinks, they were having happy. They were happy, very happy. Yeah. So this is the kind of tales that went on in my house. Trying to think of some of the things. Can you imagine you guys growing up in a house with 8 beautiful girls? And I can say that they attracted a lot of boys, and I can say for a long time, I thought these kids were coming over here to play with me, and I found out they had no interest in me, It was these 8 sisters of mine, and one was more beautiful than the other. But anyway, growing up in that house, and then right down the street, I don't know if you knew it, my grandmother and grandfather Dannenholm, they had a big house on the corner there. And I understand as grandfather Dannenholm then bought a bunch of lots up and down Lexington Road, and each one of his children got married. He would give them a lot and then build them a house. So that's the way. While we were all within about 2 blocks of each other, all these children, and we had more cousins and so forth. But these are all the crazy things that I grew up with. I'm trying to think. Well, Big Helen. Now, some of you all might know about. I had not 8 sisters, but a ninth sister. And she was Big Helen Braun, and she was an orphan and grew up in St. Joseph's Orphanage. And Dad prescribed or sent the medicine to the orphan's home. So the nuns came to Dad one day and says, as our children get up to about the 8th grade, we have to get them out of here to get more children in. And he said, we try to place boys and girls in good families. So he says, we got a nice girl there that I think you really like. She's been trained. She knows how to make up beds and wash dishes, and said, I think she'd be nice in your household. Well, Dad said, if that's what you want to do, we'll do. So we got a lady that came to our house, and she wasn't there but too long. Her name was Helen. Somewhere along there, my mother had actually she had 11 children, one died, but this girl came along, and Big Helen had been there for several years, and she was so well thought of, so my mother and Dad named my sister Helen. So we had 2 Helens in the household. Well, that kind of led to some confusion. So when we finally got it down, the youngest Helen, she was Little Helen, and the housekeeper was Big Helen. So when you come in the house, whether you want to talk to Little Helen or Big Helen, Of course, you talk to Big Helen if you were, did you wash those pants, or did you wash my blouse, or did you do this? And this is the stuff I grew up with. And like I said, there was a whole lot of boys come around that house because I ate beautiful sisters. The one was pretty than the other, but I was too young and too dumb to appreciate girls. Because girls were nothing to me. I had her everywhere in my house. So it took me a long time, and I was always slow until my dad had this drugstore, and one day I had been in and out of the Army. And when I was in the Army, all these guys in these barracks that I was in talked about girls. And I thought it was kind of disgusting, some of the things they said. I know gentlemen should not talk like that. But anyway, I didn't realize what girls meant to you. And when I got out of the Army, I went to forestry school. I worked at Denny's drugstore. And one day, a young girl came to the drugstore. And I kind of looked through it. My golly, that's something special. Well, she went out the front door and started wrapping around the corner. Well, I ran back to the store and opened this door and stuck my head out there. And I almost fell on my face because I followed that girl all the way down the street. So it turned out to be Martha, and that was my wife. So, and all the crazy things we did. Now, in those days, and I don't know if you all are aware, but I wouldn't say my dad was a very strong Catholic, and you did everything Catholic was. Just like Lent. Whoever, I don't know what people do in Lent these days, but my dad went to Mass at 6:30 every morning, or 5:30 or 6, I forgot which, and we were all expected to be up and go with him. This is Lent. You did every day. So, my sisters, of course, they kind of moaned and groaned a little bit, and so I learned later they would always put their heavy coat on. It went down pretty long below their knees. They would not take their pajamas off. They would take and roll their pants legs up and put their pajamas on. They would go to church in their pajamas, but of course they had a great big coat around them. And I think Dad learned about that later, and he was horrified. He took these girls to church in their pajamas, of all things. But this is the kind of stuff. Well, fortunately, my sisters all started about World War II getting married. They all found these beautiful boys that they married up, especially on 32nd Street. I think I had 3 brother-in-laws that came from 32nd, Oliver Shine, Jerry Roberts, and Bill Fetzer. And they all were living about a block. I don't know how they all lived in that block, and all of a sudden met all these sisters about it.
Word spread about the Hinkebeins.
What's that?
I said word spread about those beautiful girls.
Yeah, the East End girls and the West End boys.
Well, like I said, all these boys are hanging around the house, and I thought, I'm so lucky these guys are going to come and play with me. And it was my sisters they were after. So anyway, it seemed like somewhere around maybe 39 or 40, these girls started getting married. Well, Dad gave them all a big church wedding at St. Francis of Rome. After the church wedding, we always went to the Kentucky Hotel, and he had a breakfast for them. Well, there maybe be 102 people there. It was a big, and then we would go home at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. People would start coming to the house, and there would be another party going on. So, and then World War II started, and all these sisters of mine started getting married, and all the people from out in the country came to town to work in war plants and get rich, because these people are working on these farms around there. Other than the stuff they grew, that's the only thing they had to eat, because they couldn't afford to go to A&P or a grocery store. And so this is the kind of stuff that went on. And,
Daddy, tell them the story about your mom buying all the bread and making the sandwiches. Buying all the bread and making the sandwiches.
Every evening at the drugstore, before I think we'd go home and eat supper about 6 o'clock. Well, I had to go to the little grocery store there and buy 6 loaves of bread. Every day I bought 6 loaves of bread, and the next day we needed 6 more, and the next day we needed 6 more. Yeah, 8 sisters and 2 boys. So you can see what my mom and dad had to put up with. But
Dad, how your mother made the sandwiches. gave them to the people.
Oh yeah, well
Hungry
that's another story. Lexington Road then was a very small 2-lane road. And this was back during the so-called Depression days in the 30s, and it was times are very, very, very bad. And we had a lot of what we called tramps coming up and down Lexington Road, going from one place to another. And across the street was a great big Lambton house back there, and they had a lot of trees out in front of it. And these so-called tramps, they would sleep over in these places. And they'd come to the house and knock on the back door. And Mother would always, they always wanted something to eat. So Mother always gave them a glass of milk, and she'd fix them a couple of bologna sandwiches or something. They'd sit on the back step. She wouldn't let them in the house, but sit on the back step and give them a sandwich, and then they'd go on. So this is the kind of things I kind of grew up with. Of course, Dad owned this drugstore. And, oh yeah, yeah. Well, Dad owned this drugstore, and he was very, I guess, well-to-do in his day and time. He was a self-made man, and so he bought there was an empty lot next door, and he had a bank coming, First National Bank of Kentucky. They wanted to rent it, so he built them the building and put in a great big walk-in vault, which they demanded, and they were going to rent this thing from them. And their story was if they ever moved out, they were required to take the vault out. Well, of course, they went broke during the 30s, and the vault stayed there. I don't know if you ever go down there in Frankfort, Bigley Avenue, the next door building. If you go in that building, the vault is still there, because nobody could afford to take it out of there. So other than that, and then Doug's drugstore, he had a big empty space above the drugstore, which I was told was a dance studio. He rented to somebody. They gave dancing lessons. A great big place up there. So they come along, and then Dad remodeled it and built 3 apartments up there. It was and my wife and I, we were in there, but all my sisters at one time or another were getting married during World War II. And you couldn't get an apartment anywhere in town because everybody was coming to town from the country. So Dad sent those 3 apartments, and I had one of them, and they were what they referred to as an efficiency apartment. You had a living room with 2 big dark doors, and you pull those doors apart and you pull the bed out of the wall. And that's your bed. And when you're through in the morning, you fold that thing up and you slide it up. Then you had a little bit of bathroom and a little bit so forth, and a little kitchen. So I think every one of my sisters, as they got married, lived there until they had I guess an accumulation or whatever to move someplace else. So these are some of the memories I grew up with. As I told you, my grandmother lived right down the street. And what always impressed me, my grandmother could not drive a car, so she always had a chauffeur. And the chauffeur, grandmother's house, there was a big lot of buildings across the back. There was a 2-story building. It was always painted green. It was all wood. There was one part of the building, well, I guess, where it was like a tool shed. And you had all the tools and the lawnmowers and stuff to take care of, and this and this and this. And then you had a place for the horse and buggies. And then they had a place for the automobiles that were coming, so she had an automobile. So this is the kind of stuff that I grew up with. Listen to all these stories. I'm trying to think of some more of those.
Daddy, how about the pink ladies?
Oh, well, Sally reminded me, my mother was, I guess you might say, social lady, and she and Dad liked to play bridge. That was the game that ladies and gentlemen played in those days. They may do it now, I don't know. But Mother would have her, I guess, once a month, she'd have her turn to have it at our house. And she would always have a luncheon, and then 2 or 3 tables of bridge. And Dad would come from the drugstore and bring his expertise, alcohol, with him, and he would make what was known as, and it was kind of a pretty frosty drink, a pink lady. And so it was something with alcohol in it. And There used to be 2 tables, and these ladies, I'm telling you, they were all laughing and cutting up and having more darn fun, all because of the pink lady. The second one that just set them off. They just had a good time. So, and then, of course, my mom and dad, they would have their own pleasure. And mom and dad were both, dad particularly, he liked sports. He liked Notre Dame and he liked UK. He loved them both. As you know, dad was a pharmacist. And the pharmacy then in Louisville was at 1st and Chestnut Street. And Dad had a great love for the pharmacy school. So it was, I guess you'd say, a private school. It wasn't connected with anything. And Dad supported in every way he could. He was the volunteer treasurer. He took care of all the books and signed all the checks and paid everybody that had to be paid and made sure they were on sound footing. So he did all that for years and years and years, and finally it got to be that it was almost too much, and all the older people that ran all this stuff were all dying off. So he went to see the University of Louisville. He wanted to take the pharmacy school to the University of Louisville. Well, they rejected it for some reason, I don't know why. So then later on he went to UK, and they built a new, well, UK rented here in Louisville for a while, and I went to school there. Then they built a pharmacy school in Lexington, and that's where, and it moved it all up to Lexington. So that's the history of these things. And I can tell you now, about the drugstore, I don't know if I told you, this big dance studio turned into 3 apartments. And as all my sisters got married during World War II, they were able to get a place to live because you could, all the people from out in the country came to Louisville to work in the Army munition factory. So this is the kind of stuff that went on, and I loved it. I don't know if I got any more stories to tell or not. More, I don't know, you want me to spell it for a while? What's that?